Hello. Our big story this week, the chapter of our big story, is a sad one. It's exile. You see, the Israelites received God's law, which was a gift. It showed them exactly how they could choose life, how they could live in God's blessing, how they could have full, abundant lives. But they could not follow God's law, and they did not follow God's law. And what they learned is that the law did not bring life on its own because it was impossible for them to follow it. And they had king after David, who made really poor choices, and led the people of Israel into making really poor choices. Choices that did not lead them to love God. Choices that did not lead them to love their neighbor. God sent prophets to warn them, to try to pull them back to following God, to loving their neighbor. And they didn't listen to the prophets. They kept on making bad choices. And finally, the consequences that God warned about came true, and they were conquered by Babylon and led away into exile. And in exile, they mourned and they longed for restoration. And they called out to God again and again to rescue us from exile. We're sorry. We want to come back to you. And God heard. In fact, God had never stopped hearing them. And there's this wonderful series of verses in the middle of Lamentations. It's on the sheet, one of the references you can read. And Lamentations is a book that was written about the exile experience and how horrible it is. And really, it's 5 chapters of lamenting, of describing just how horrible everything was and what had happened to them. But right in the middle, it says, I remember this, and when I remember this, I have hope that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And that was true for the Israelites in exile. When you look at the stories of exile, Daniel is the story in the children's storybook Bible, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And you can see how that steadfast love continued with God's people and even spilled over from God's people to their captives, to King Nebuchadnezzar, to King Darius. They too experienced God through God's faithfulness to Daniel and the others. And God was not only showing God's faithfulness through people like Daniel, God was also continuing this plan for a rescuer to come, for a Messiah to come, for someone to come who would lead the Israelites out of this continuing cycle of disobedience and consequences, who would give a new covenant of the law in their hearts, who would follow the law in a way they couldn't. And that's the Messiah to come. And that's what we're going to start kind of leaning into next week as we start looking at more of what the prophets said about this rescuer to come, and as we prepare for Advent and our own waiting for a big event to come. So I'm excited about starting with Advent. As far as a activity for this week, it might be just kind of fun to build up Jerusalem and have the Babylonian army knock it down. Use blocks or Legos, little miniatures, lead them into exile, and talk about how this was a consequence of not following the law, but also how restoration was coming. And that the Israelites would be led back into Jerusalem. So that's an idea I have for an activity. It's always fun to knock down blocks, especially if your kid gets to be the one knocking it down.